one of the most popular national media members, does not believe in the Minnesota Vikings. And it's been surfacing all over X because Minnesota Vikings fans are a little offended by a little national media member, one of the most popular, one of the highest paid ever, doesn't believe in the Sam Darnold-led Minnesota Vikings, who are 2-0. And there's a little debate on this talk show. Which 2-0 team do you least believe in? And it was like the Seahawks, the Buccaneers, and the Minnesota Vikings were another option. Well, let's just see what he had to say about our Minnesota Vikings.
You'll appreciate where I'm going to come from with this one, Dan Orlovsky. Fair enough. You make a very valid point with your points about the Seattle Seahawks. Congratulations, miracles do happen. let me throw some history from you here. From 2020 to 2022, they had Kirk Cousins, they had Dalvin Cook, they had Justin Jefferson, and they also ended up with one playoff game over 3 seasons. The Minnesota Vikings have been known to have some talent and somehow, some way not get it done. That's number one. Let's go to Sam Darnold. This season thus far, right? 60 in a clean pocket, 65% of his dropbacks, 83% completions, 3 touchdowns and an interception. When he's under pressure, 35% of his dropbacks. His completion percentage goes from 83% to 43%. 1 touchdown, 1 interception. That sounds like the Sam Darnold that I recall. That seems like the Sam Darnold that I watched over his career thus far. Let's not ignore that. Let's not act like that little nugget of information doesn't matter. With somebody else, fine. With him, I'm allowed to hold on to it until further notice. Evidence is evidence.
Dan Orlovsky and Stephen A. Smith have been going at it for a while now. Dan Orlovsky said the Minnesota Vikings could be playoff contenders, or at least contenders to make the playoffs before the regular season started. And Stephen A. Smith did his Stephen A. Smith. Are you kidding me? Sam Darnold. This is preposterous. How can Sam Darnold lead the Minnesota Vikings to the playoffs? That is not possible. So Stephen A. Smith did his Stephen A. Smith thing, which I don't necessarily disagree with anything Stephen A. Smith said. You look at what the Minnesota Vikings are competing against versus those other 2 teams. The Buccaneers play in one of the worst divisions in football, and the Atlanta Falcons have 1 win because the Eagles had an epic collapse. And they play the Chiefs this weekend. The Buccaneers are looking like the front runner to win that division. The Seahawks, well, the Arizona Cardinals are 1-1. The 49ers are 1-1. Those Los Angeles Rams looks like they're not going nowhere this year with Cooper Kupp injured, Puka Nacua injured, and they're 0-2. Seems like a legitimate chance for both the Buccaneers and the Seahawks to make the playoffs. Plus, both of those teams have quarterbacks that have been playing out of their mind in recent years. Their defense is good. And they have solid teams around those quarterbacks. There is nothing that I disagree with from Stephen A. Smith. In fact, I think that this is one of my pet peeves. One of my biggest pet peeves is when a national media member like Stephen A. Smith or Colin Cowherd says something negative about your team, and everyone trashes them on X because they're offended by a opinion that they have about a Minnesota sports team, whether it be the Vikings or Timberwolves, Twins. They never talk about the Wild, but you get the idea. And then maybe a week or 2 later, or a month or 2 later, or a year or 2 later, whenever, one of the national sports talk show hosts will say something great about a Minnesota sports team. And they will just bow down at their feet, calling them the greatest sports talk show hosts in the history of the world. And it bothers me because you're not thinking critically about what they're saying. You're either offended because they're criticizing you, or you are praising them because they're praising your team. It's like, don't be a bunch of... There's a word that I'm not going to say, but I really want to say it. Fine, I'll say it. Don't be a bunch of wusses. Well, what rhymes with wusses? Wussies? Wussies. What rhymes with wussies? Think about it. Minnesota sports fans, quit being wussies. Stephen A. Smith is right. The Minnesota Vikings, out of the 2-0 teams between the Buccaneers, the Seahawks, and them, have the least likely chance to make the playoffs when you consider their competition in the division. The Detroit Lions are probably still the front runners. The Green Bay Packers are right behind them. And then it's probably the Minnesota Vikings and Chicago Bears, because the Bears look awful this season. So, Stephen A. Smith, one of the highest paid national sports talk shows in the world ever, criticized the Minnesota Vikings. And everybody gets so offended. Everyone, oh my gosh, how could a national sports talk show host criticize our team? And he makes valid points. Sam Darnold one time had a great start with the Carolina Panthers, and everything turned on its head and the season fell apart for the Panthers. It's possible, if not likely, for that to even happen again for Sam Darnold and the Minnesota Vikings. So he was critical, he was objective, and Stephen A. Smith was right about the Minnesota Vikings. And he brought up history, which I don't know if Kirk Cousins has anything to do with this season. He's not even on the team anymore, so I don't quite understand the comparison there. But historically, the Minnesota Vikings have come up short when it matters most, whether it's a playoff game or if it's just getting to the playoffs in recent years. And he talks about 2020 to 2022. The Vikings lost to the Giants in the playoffs. Daniel Jones got paid after that, which I'm sure the Giants are regretting. But you get the idea. The Vikings have come up short historically, and that's what Stephen A. Smith is pointing out. And even though those past seasons really have nothing to do at all with what the Minnesota Vikings roster currently looks like, I get where he's going. So, anyway, no criticism coming towards Stephen A. Smith from the Minnesota Tim podcast.